So COVID may have done one thing pretty effectively, and it's show a lot of us who may not have already been aware of this, that there's a lot of deception that comes from media and the way a media will frame certain situations. And, we're going to break this down a little bit here. I have Richard Garner, the host of a Third Way podcast, who also happens to have worked in media for quite a while and has a lot of insight into how things work here. And we're going to talk about how, during this time of COVID, there's been a lot of efforts within mainstream media specifically to sort of create this idea that there's just a small group of very unhinged individuals who are not going along with these ideas, and that everybody else is pretty much just a good person. But that's obviously not true. There's a lot more to this discussion, and we're going to break it down here. Welcome, Richard. How are we going to start off this conversation?
Well, I mean, what better way to start off this conversation than to use a recent example? This past weekend, obviously, there was this global Day of Freedom demonstrations from, major cities across North America, Europe, around the world. Coordinated similar to one that I attended in 2003 that was about trying to prevent the U.S. from going into Iraq. And although that was the biggest turnout, Joe, in history for a global protest, didn't work, did it? In the end, they did what they wanted. And they went forward with the agenda, regardless of the fact that people from around the world demonstrated that this was highly unpopular. Well, cut to January 22nd, 2022. And in some cases, the numbers were similar. In some cases, the numbers weren't. In some cases, the numbers were more depending where you were, the weather, et cetera, what city. But what you do notice right away is, how is the media going to cover this? And again, it's not you and I's first rodeo here, as they say. So you already know the playbook, right? Okay, so you're going to downplay the numbers so that, the part of you that's programmed as a human being to want to be part of society, well, you don't want to be part of some crazy group over there, some small group of people who are dumb or uneducated or are worse. They're not good people. Well, I mean, you're playing into somebody's natural desire evolutionarily not to want to align with something like that. So then the information that particular group would support, you're already biased against it because you want to be part of the group. So first of all, you're going to use descriptions like hundreds or thousands, regardless of whether there's 50,000 or 60,000 or 70,000. Conversely, if this was a protest that aligned with your agenda, the narrative that you support in the world, you do the opposite. If there's 40,000 people, you're going to say tens of thousands. If there's 40,000 people in this case, you're going to say thousands, because you don't want people to believe that there was a large contingent of people out there. Then, Joe, you actually watch the reporting. Now, you and I were going back and forth day of in the real world of real-time journalism, and we could see zero reporting during the actual day. And again, Saturday, it's easy to kill a story. It's not the same type of media focus on a Saturday or on the weekend, but you couldn't see any real coverage in real time. Later on, there were stories filed by people like in Canada, the CTV and the CBC. Of course, around the world, BBC, Al Jazeera. There was some coverage in the U.S. We'll get to that in a second. But if you look at some of this coverage here from CBC's report, one of the tricks of the trade, Joe, again, from somebody who's been in this business for a long time, is, again, you can convey what you want by how you shoot it and how you edit it. So if you watch this particular coverage and these shots that you're looking at now, what do you notice about these shots? Well, in the business, you would call these tight shots, right? These are all medium range close-ups or, tight shots that don't show a massive crowd. They're not obviously zoomed out showing you the full scope of how many people are there. Well, why, Joe? Is they don't have the equipment to do that? Technically, they don't have the capacity to do that? Well, of course not, obviously, because we've seen that type of coverage and those types of angles used in other protests. So when you're doing something like that, again, you are conscious of what you're doing. You're trying to demonstrate that, yeah, there were people there, but it wasn't some really massive thing that you should be paying attention to. There's tens of thousands of people there, which is a news story regardless of what it's about. You don't choose whether it's a news story. You cover things where it's demonstrable that many people are coming to talk about something. And again, you don't have to support what they're doing, but you also don't have to pick an agenda or use it as a Trojan horse, as we saw in some of the coverage, to then A, marginalize the people, and then B, use it as an example to insert statistics that might support an agenda that you agree with. Now, you might think that the times we're in call for this type of editorializing disguised as journalism. I would disagree. I think you would disagree. And history will be the judge of whether this was quote unquote ethical journalism, accurate coverage, an attempt to be objective, or a deliberate attempt to manipulate the scope of something that's going on because you believe that you know what's right for the people more than what you're supposed to do as journalists and media outlets, which is report the news and let people decide.
Yeah, it's sort of this disingenuous, almost manipulative way of basically just saying, you know, this is not too important. You shouldn't really look at this, you know, in terms of the media. And you know, going back to what you claimed there with regards to the sort of the lying with statistics piece, you know, in that CBC piece that, you know, is that classic line where they say something to the effect of, well, you know, even though these anti-vax people are saying, you know, what they're saying about the vaccine, you know, their vaccinated counterpart are at 80% less risk of being hospitalized. But, you know, never do we see the media really put those types of numbers into context, explaining things like, you know, both vaccinated and unvaccinated people have less than 1% chance of being hospitalized, so on and so forth. And really breaking down the comorbidities factor, the age factor. Everything's just simplified and made into these, like, you hear a statistic and it's like, oh, wow, this is crazy. Why would these people support this? But if these numbers were in context, it would be a completely different story.
One of the things that you hoped to see in terms of the coverage of this particular day is that it was not an anti-vax protest. There were people there that were anti-restrictions, anti-mandates. I'm sick of the kids being sent home. There were people, obviously, that were also unvaccinated or vaccine hesitant, and there were anti-vax people.
Yeah.
So that's a spectrum of different reasons why people came out to quote unquote protest about freedoms being taken away. They did cite that off the top of that piece, but again, you saw other pieces like that MSNBC piece where literally, Joe, they don't show any pictures. Like they show, so their coverage of the freedom, whatever you want to call it, the freedom protests of that day were two talking heads that were going to break down how crazy these people are, give that general academic description of what a conspiracy theorist is and why they're so prone. Because, Joe, as this academic expert on the panel describes, you know, they have a problem with trust. History is nothing but littered with examples that people in power lie and conspire in their own interests. So why would it make sense for somebody to go out and explain away somebody's concerns by saying, yeah, they're crazy, they just don't trust institutions?
But, you know, and again, this is, you know, MSNBC, and which is obviously left-leaning, and, you know, we've looked at in previous videos some polls that indicate how, you know, there are specifically on the left, and again, we're not picking on the left here, we're just talking about the media they're seeing and how that's impacting their perception. But, you know, you see in some of this previous work we've done, it's like, the left is significantly out of touch, like massively out of touch with the reality of the risks of COVID. And when you look at some of these types of videos and you look at the way that you know, the media is covering this on the left, it's like they're making people that are unvaccinated seem like crazy delusional individuals that are just walking factories for variants and that are constantly infected with COVID, and they're always going to kill you and they're always going to be the ones in hospitals. You know, they're sending this sentiment, and it's creating very real world examples of people being very misled about what's going on and just living in a reality that quite frankly isn't real.
Well, and so what I would say to that is, you know what that indicates, Joe? That they're not liberal. Mm-hmm. That's the thing that's gotten lost in the semantics game going on right now, left, right, liberal, conservative. Well, what is, by my definition in history, considered to be left-leaning and liberal? Well, ACLU level support of rights and freedoms, right? That's a tent pole of being left-leaning and liberal. That you're obviously skeptical of mainstream media, corporate media. Hello, Noam Chomsky and manufacturing consent. And of course, you know the history of corporate and government conspiring together through decades of and centuries of evidence of them saying one thing, doing another, and ultimately finding a way to fatten their bank accounts at the expense of the people. That's 2 + 2 = 4. There's literally a joke in our culture that, how do you know when a politician's lying? Their lips are moving. That's something that everybody knows. This is as known as the sun coming up in the east. So again, that would, all those things I've just described would be somebody who is considered left-leaning and liberal. And the last part of that, those pillars, would be somebody who, especially in the, let's say, black and white 80s, where the evangelical right was really trying to ultimately impose a way of living, a moral authority, the Jimmy Swaggarts, the Jerry Falwells, the Jim Bakers, and, you know, lawsuits at the Supreme Court of the US with Larry Flint and whatever on free speech. And you would find yourself in these conversations maybe with people that were very intractable on, well, obviously black people are more prone to being criminals. And you'd, well, 90% of, you know, jails are filled with black people. And that's the end of their statistical analysis. That, therefore, proves that black people are inherently criminal. The liberal or the left-leaning person would have to be the person who would say, okay, well, we're going to have to get into context and nuance here to break down what you just said. Because, yes, you can say that, but here's why that's flawed. Here's the real reason why they're disproportionately black people. It goes back generations to this, that, socioeconomics, slavery, whatever. And you'd get, in the end, when the person got frustrated, you'd get, I don't want to hear your excuses, you bleeding heart liberal. Cut to, Joe, 2022. And the person telling you they don't want to hear your excuses, your nuanced context to the whole situations, people who self-identify, key here, as liberals. But the left-leaning or the perceived left media is corporate media disguised as liberal media. Because to your point, when you're judging 80, 70, 80% of the population and you're out of touch with that and you're defaulting to, oh, these deplorables, these dummies, these unwashed, the great unwashed, these idiots, well, you're no longer left, you're elite. Mm-hmm. You're elitist. And you're telling yourself that you're somehow left, but you support all the policies that continue to prop up capitalism, the 1%, and the upper middle class, of which you generally occupy, no pun intended. So from that left-right thing where we're at, that's why the MSNBCs and the CNNs of the world cover things that way, because they're not left, they're elitist.
And I think this is where it's key to really understand our own biases, really understand ourselves here, because we can't control that media is going to stop or whatever. But if we understand ourselves and we get clear within ourselves and our biases, we can see them more clearly within media and within other people's voices, which I think at the end of the day doesn't mean, okay, we just shut them off. We actually learn where to take, useful information from each one. And I think that's become a big thing right now because everybody in some way, shape, or form from everywhere is going to have a useful nugget. But if we're just, shutting people off per se because they said one thing wrong, that could lead us down a dangerous path in its own way.
Yeah, and just as a tip to leave people with, like and again, I understand many people are so busy that they don't have time to sort of be a citizen journalist and fact check on their own, not by fact checkers. And check multiple sources, but bookmark a conservative media source a liberal media source, an international media source, and a local media source. And if you can, when there's a story, a major media story, just go back and forth between those 4 bookmarks and see what the headline is, what they've chosen to focus you on, and then where they position things within the article to either bring attention to up top or essentially bury the lead down in the bottom, whatever. And I guarantee you, you will start, you'll be more media literate, and you'll be able to then parse all the different information and come up with something closer to the truth.
Yeah, that's well said. And, I think there's a lot of stuff here to think about, as always. It's we're in a time where, again, it's on us as individuals to do this. Authority is not going to suddenly come clean and, erase what they've been doing for a very long time. It's going to be upon people to create a new culture here, have new discussions, and be a little bit more grounded in our approach to things. As always, Richard, appreciate your insight on this, and that's it. That's all. We'll be back for more in the near future here.
Great stuff, Joe. Thanks.